Hi guys, it's Braden from Fisherman's Source here, and I'm here today to talk to you about jigging, and in particular slow pitch jigging. Hopefully today we will clear up a few of the misconceptions, answer some of the basic questions about what slow pitch jigging is and isn't, when to do it, why to do it, and really just kind of give an introductory to what it is, what it isn't, and why you want to do it or don't want to do it. I think a lot of the confusion about slow pitch jigging comes around just from the term jigging in general. Jigging can mean so many different things to so many different people, whether you're East Coast, West Coast, whether you're a Gulf guy. Traditionally I was taught about yo-yo jigging or squidding, things like metal jigs, such as diamond jigs, or yo-yo jigging, things like Viking jigs, which has been around for a very long time, popular here in the Northeast. And then other guys will talk about jigging and they mean bouncing or swimming a bucktail jig, whether you're fishing for fluke or flounder or cobia for that matter. All different forms of jigging. And then we get into high-speed jigging where we're ripping jigs up and down through the water column. None of that is actually slow pitch jigging. Slow pitch jigging in its simplest form is using a keeled metal jig and working it in a relatively narrow band of water. And the reason it has to be a keeled jig is the jig itself is going to cut back and forth or pitch as it settles and flutters down toward the bottom. This is done through a series of either using the reel or the rod, but it's actually the rod that imparts most of the action to the jig. And one of the questions we get a lot is the average slow pitch rod has a relatively narrow weight rating for the jigs that they're made for. And the other thing is they're incredibly flexible. They bend more and are lighter than any, lighter in the tip than any other rod for catching a comparable sized fish. And I think that also leads to a lot of the confusion about what it is, what it isn't, and why you need a certain rod to do that. To me, in its traditional form, a slow pitch action is done by actually not moving the rod in a jigging motion. It's done by actually taking a crank of the reel with the rod still. When you do that, and the jig's on the bottom or near the bottom, the rod will actually load up as you turn the handle, and then as you keep it still, the rod itself will deflect back, and that's what actually lifts the jig and gives it the action that you want to then settle back toward down to the bottom as it will float back down. It's not a technique that's generally done with giant lifts of the rod. You can do it, lifting the rod slow and easy and letting that jig flutter down as you track it down. But the reason that these rods are made so light in the tip is so that the rod itself can work the jig after the reel has been turned and use the reel to load the rod. Why do you want a slow pitch jig? Why is it becoming so popular? When do you want to do it and for what? Slow pitch jigging works really well in two specific circumstances to me. Number one, it's when you're trying to fish a very narrow level in the water column, especially if you're fishing on the bottom for things like sea bass and grouper and snapper or tuna that are hugging the bottom. It allows you to work a jig in a very controlled manner and keep it at a depth that you want. Most slow pitch jigging, I would go as far as to say, is done within the bottom 10 feet of the water column, normally even tighter to the bottom of that, and allows you to keep that jig working right where those fish live, right in that range of water column. The other reason that slow pitch jigging can be so effective is because the action of the jig, the way it is actually raising slowly and then flutters down, does a very good job at mimicking an actual dying bait fish, which, if you can get that action correct, will oftentimes actually trigger a feeding response or a predatory response on a fish that might not have been active and might have been inactive, but you get that jig to pitch just right like a wounded dying bait fish, you can actually get a neutral fish to eat. And we see this everywhere from, this is particularly popular as far as, like I said, grouper, snapper. If you go heavy enough or you have a light enough current, it works very well for tilefish as well, both blue lines and goldens. West Coast guys, yellowtailing, rockfish, tuna right on the bottom, it can work for all of those as well. Why do you need specialized tackle, I guess, is the other question that we get asked a lot. And once again, in order to fish the size and weight jigs that we want to fish, oftentimes we have to fish very light, very thin lines to do this. And like I said, the rod itself deflecting down and coming back up is what actually moves the jig. So if you have a rod that's too heavy, it won't actually load when you take a crank of the handle or you take a turn of that handle to properly pitch that jig back up. Another thing to discuss is kind of what makes a slow pitch rod a slow pitch rod. And I'm going to say the two big examples of that, or the big differences between a standard rod and a slow pitch rod. Number one are going to be the butt of the rod. Most slow pitch rods are going to have an exposed blank with some sort of knob or stop on the end. And that's because the vast majority of the time the rod actually stays tucked in your armpit, and a thinner grip allows that to be a lot more comfortable, honestly. And number two is going to be the flexibility of the rod and how light that rod is. And this is one of those times where, because it's the rod bending and then recovering that actually moves the jig, unfortunately the rods are designed to work a relatively limited weight range of jigs properly. So you're not going to be able to work a 100-gram jig the same way, or with the same rod that you're using a 350-gram jig for. A lot of guys kind of want to have one rod to do it all, and this is just one technique where that really doesn't work. Another thing to note about the rods and fighting a fish with a rod this light is, because the rod has so little backbone, is so parabolic, and has such a slow action, when you do hook up a big fish, the vast majority of the fight is actually on the reel. It's very normal, on a fight with a big fish, to have this rod completely doubled over down to the last guide, and almost all the pressure will be actually on the reel itself. It doesn't mean you can't land very large fish using this technique. The amount of snapper, grouper, amberjack that are caught on slow pitch rods and slow pitch jigs is astounding. You just have to be prepared for that during the fight and understand you're really not going to be able to lift with the rod to move those fish. Guys, we have a lot of slow pitch tackle available for purchase here at the shop. We have rods from Jigging World, Shimano, Daiwa, Centaur, all designed specifically for slow pitch jigging. We also have a wide variety of jigs from manufacturers such as JYG, Nomad, Shimano, Major Craft, and a variety of others as well. If you have any questions, please stop by our website or swing by and see us. Chris or I would love to kind of go over this a little more with you, really kind of get into the who, what, why, and where of the technique. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please reach out. This is Braden from Fisherman's Source.